The forest was quieter than usual that evening. The wind had died down, and the only sounds that reached my ears were the soft rustling of leaves underfoot and the distant chirping of crickets. I walked alone, my boots crunching on the dirt path. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, leaving only the faintest glow of orange and pink in the sky, the world felt peaceful, untouched by the chaos of everyday life. But I didn't feel peaceful. It wasn't the darkening sky or the shadows that crept between the trees. It wasn't the absence of light that made me uneasy. It was something deeper. A nagging sensation in the back of my mind, a feeling that something wasn't right, that the universe had nudged me off course. I had been walking this same path for years, after all. The trees, the hills, the creeks, they were familiar, constant. But tonight they felt different, foreign in a way I couldn't explain. I paused, my gaze lifting to the line of trees ahead of me. Then I heard it. A soft, barely audible sound, a rustling, almost like the wind shifting. But no, it wasn't the wind. It was a faint, almost imperceptible cry. My heart leapt in my chest. I had to be imagining it. But something in me, some primal instinct, urged me forward. I stepped off the trail, moving toward the sound with hesitant steps. The underbrush parted easily as I pushed through, branches brushing against my face, the dirt giving way under my feet as I ventured deeper into the woods. And then I saw her. She lay there, hidden amongst the tall grass and vibrant wildflowers, her body curled in a fragile, almost fetal position. My first instinct was to turn away, to run, to pretend I hadn't seen what was right in front of me. But I couldn't. There was something about her, a pull, an invisible tether that kept me rooted in place. She wasn't human, at least not in the way I understood humans. Her skin shimmered, a strange blend of green and violet, the colors shifting as if they were alive. Her long silver hair framed her face like a halo, glowing softly in the dim light. Her eyes were closed, but I could see the way her chest moved, slow and shallow, as if she were struggling to breathe. I knelt beside her, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached out hesitantly, not sure what I was doing, but something in me knew I had to help. Her skin was warm to the touch, and I felt a rush of relief. At least she wasn't cold, lifeless. But her breathing, it was too shallow, too weak. I gently placed my hand on her forehead, feeling the faint pulse of her body, but it was unsteady. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment I thought she might be confused, or perhaps even afraid. But instead there was something else in her gaze, something vulnerable. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her lips trembled as she spoke, as though even the effort to form words was too much. "Please help me." I froze. Her words hit me like a wave, crashing over me with a force I wasn't prepared for. Help her? What was I supposed to do? I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't even equipped to deal with this. But I couldn't turn away. Not now. Not after seeing her, after hearing that desperate plea. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What happened to you?" Her eyes flickered with recognition, and she blinked slowly as though the effort drained her. She lifted her hand weakly, her fingers brushing against my own. I felt a strange tingling sensation where her skin met mine. It was as if there was some unseen force between us, something both fragile and powerful. "I don't know," she murmured, her voice tinged with confusion and fear. "I was sent here, to your world, but something went wrong. I don't know how to get back." I stared at her, trying to make sense of her words. Sent here? From where? And how had she ended up alone in the middle of a forest, barely alive? "Who sent you?" I asked, my brow furrowing in concern. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, her lips trembling as she spoke again. "The others. They left me. I was supposed to be with them, but they abandoned me. Now I'm alone." Her voice cracked, and I saw the pain in her eyes. She wasn't just lost, she was abandoned, and the thought of it gnawed at me, making my chest tighten with something like anger. Anger at whoever had left her. Here, angry at the helplessness I saw in her expression. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't just leave her here, alone and vulnerable. "Hey," I said softly, brushing her silver hair back from her face. "You're not alone anymore. I'm here, okay? I'll help you." I don't know how, but I will." She didn't speak right away. Instead, she closed her eyes, a small sigh escaping her lips. For a moment, I thought she had fallen unconscious again. But then she opened her eyes, and the look in them was different. There was a strange intensity there, as though she were weighing something in her mind. "I have no reward to offer," she said, her voice low and almost apologetic. "I don't have riches or gold, nothing that you could use." I frowned, confused. "You don't have to offer me anything. I'm just trying to help you." But she shook her head, her delicate features tightening with resolve. "No, I can't leave you empty-handed. I don't want to owe you anything." She reached for me, her hand trembling as it hovered near my chest. Her fingers brushed lightly against my skin, and I felt a strange warmth flood through me. There was something in her touch, something that felt like it was both a gift and a burden. "I will give you something," she whispered. "A gift. A rare gift. But it's all I have." "A gift?" I echoed, still not understanding. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, and then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I will give you my milk. It's a sacred gift in my world, a gift of strength and life." "Milk?" The word hung in the air, and I stared at her, unsure of how to react. My mind scrambled to comprehend what she was saying, but all I could think about was the sadness in her eyes. This wasn't about some strange alien offering. This was her way of trying to repay me, even if she had nothing else to give. I could see the sincerity in her expression, the deep gratitude that overflowed from her. But it wasn't just the gratitude that moved me. It was the quiet trust she was placing in me, trust that I wouldn't turn away, that I would accept her offering, however strange it seemed. I nodded, feeling something shift inside me. "Okay, if it means something to you, I accept your gift." She gave a faint smile, and for a moment I saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It was brief, but it was enough. And so, under the quiet glow of the moon, we shared that moment, not of reward or payment, but of something deeper, something unspoken. Two beings, worlds apart, bound by a promise. I didn't know how, but I knew that I would help her find her way home, no matter what it took. The forest had grown darker around us, the trees towering high above like silent sentinels, casting long shadows that stretched out toward the horizon. The moon hung low, a pale orb in the sky, casting just enough light to illuminate the fragile figure in front of me. I could see her clearly now, the way her skin seemed to pulse with a soft light of its own, and the way her silver hair shimmered like stardust caught in the night air. I wanted to ask her more, to learn everything about where she was from, about the world she'd left behind. But the moment felt delicate, like any wrong word or action might shatter the fragile connection we had formed. I wasn't sure how to navigate this strange situation. How could I help her? How could I send her back to a place I didn't even understand? Her eyes closed briefly as though she were gathering her strength, and I watched, unsure if she would speak again. The tension in the air felt thick, but there was also something tender about it, something that made me want to stay, to keep her safe, to protect her from whatever had brought her here. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice softer now, as though the words were hard to find. "You don't have to understand, you know," she said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. "Not yet. You don't have to know everything. You've done more than enough just by not turning away." I didn't know how to respond to that. It was strange. There was a sense of gratitude in her tone, but also an underlying sadness, a feeling of resignation. She wasn't just thanking me for helping her. She seemed to be thanking me for something more. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me," I said, unsure of how to express what I was really feeling. I'm just doing what feels right." Her lips trembled into a small, fragile smile. "I don't owe you anything. But I want you to know, it's not just about the milk, it's about trust, about what you've given me. I can't explain it, but you've done something more than you know." I looked at her, trying to understand, but I still couldn't quite grasp what she was saying. What did she mean by trust? By the way she spoke, it felt like she was giving me something precious, something that went beyond any material gift. "I don't know what to say," I confessed, my voice low, But I don't want to leave you here alone. I don't know what's going on, but I'll figure it out. I'll help you find a way home, I promise." Her eyes softened, the weight of her gaze feeling like it reached into the deepest parts of me. "I believe you," she whispered. "I trust you." Those words hit me harder than I had expected. Trust? She was placing it in me. I couldn't help but wonder what it meant for her to trust someone like me. Someone so ordinary, so unremarkable in comparison to her, a being from another world, a creature of unknown origins, with powers I couldn't even begin to comprehend. "I won't let you down," I said firmly, even though the uncertainty inside me was rising like a tide. I didn't know how I could keep such a promise, but there was something about the way she looked at me, something about the vulnerability in her eyes that made me want to try, made me want to protect her, to do whatever it took to help her. She nodded slightly, the smile still on her lips, but her expression grew more solemn. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice barely audible. "You have no idea what this means to me." I didn't know what to say in response, so I just sat there beside her in silence. The forest around us had grown quiet again, the sounds of the night blending together in a soft lullaby. For a long time, neither of us spoke, just existing in the quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. Eventually she stirred, shifting slightly in the grass, her body seeming to relax just a little. The tension in her posture had eased somewhat, though I could still sense the fragility of her state. She was far from being out of danger, but she was no longer as distant as she had been when I first found her. There was a faint sense of peace in the air now, as though her body was beginning to trust the world around her again. "Trust me, I think. I think I can rest now," she murmured, closing her eyes as her breath grew steadier. "I'm not fully healed, but I can sleep." I nodded, not wanting to interrupt her, but still feeling a deep unease in the pit of my stomach. She was vulnerable, alone, and I was no doctor, no expert in alien physiology. I didn't know what to do next. I could only wait for her to heal, for her to feel safe enough to explain more of what had happened to her, what had brought her to this world. As I sat there watching over her, I thought about how strange it all was, how impossible it seemed. How could someone like me, so ordinary, be the one to help someone like her, an alien, a beautiful, fragile alien, lost in a world she didn't understand? It was all too much to process, and yet I couldn't bring myself to look away. She was here with me, and that was enough for now. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the stars above flickering like distant memories. Time had lost its meaning. It felt like the world had stopped spinning just for a moment, just long enough for me to make a choice, to be here for her. And then, as the first light of dawn began to paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, I made a silent promise to her. I would find a way to get her home, no matter the cost, no matter what it took, because I had already seen the depth of her trust in me, and I wasn't about to let it go. The first light of dawn filtered through the trees, casting soft golden hues across the forest floor. It was early, still too early for most to be awake, but the quiet beauty of the moment wrapped around me like a cloak. The air was cool, crisp, and still smelled of the damp earth from the night before. I found myself watching her, watching the rise and fall of her chest as she slept. She looked more peaceful now than she had when I first found her. Her face, though pale, had softened, the tension in her features easing as she rested. But there was still something unsettling about it all. She wasn't from here. She wasn't from this world. Her delicate, otherworldly beauty, the way her skin shimmered faintly in the early light, spoke of a place beyond my comprehension. And yet, here she was. She had trusted me. She had come to me for help. And I had promised to give it. How could I keep that promise? What did she need to get back to her world, and how could I possibly help her when I had no idea what I was dealing with? I shifted uneasily on the ground, my legs stiff from sitting in the same position for too long. I glanced at her again, her breathing steady and rhythmic. Part of me wanted to stay right there, never leave her side, and ensure nothing would harm her. But there was still a world around us, the outside world, people, life, responsibilities. I had to make a plan. I had to figure out what came next. I stood up, slowly, careful not to disturb her. The early morning light illuminated the forest in a way that felt both comforting and ominous. It was as if the trees were watching, as if everything in the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The wind had picked up again, a gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. I glanced back at the girl, still sleeping peacefully, and then turned my gaze to the path ahead. The reality of the situation began to settle in. How did I even begin to explain this to anyone? To anyone who would believe me, let alone help? Didn't know what her world was like, but there had to be some way to get her back, and if I could, I would do whatever it took to make it happen. I took a few slow steps away from her, scanning the surroundings as I tried to get my bearings. The forest, though calming in its beauty, was unfamiliar. It was easy to get lost here if you didn't know where you were going. I'd have to make sure we didn't stay too long in one place, especially with her in her current condition. The last thing I wanted was to draw attention to her. Someone like her, so fragile and strange, would surely stand out in any crowd. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing. She needed rest. She needed time to heal. I could at least make sure she wasn't left alone in the wilderness. I could keep her safe until we figured things out. I glanced back at her, the protective instinct rising within me again. As I crouched down to gather a few branches for a small fire, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. My heart skipped a beat and I froze. Was someone else in the forest? I stood up slowly, peering through the trees, scanning the area around me. The forest seemed quiet, too quiet. I hadn't heard anyone approach, but the feeling that I was being watched persisted. Then, just as quickly as the feeling came, it vanished. No footsteps, no rustling in the brush, only the wind and the distant calls of birds. I shook my head, dismissing it as nothing more than nerves. I hadn't been sleeping much lately, and this situation was only making it worse. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I was being paranoid. I had to focus. My focus had to be on her, on getting her the help she needed. Turning back to her, I saw that she was still sleeping, her face serene despite the events of the night. The strange milk she had offered me, her gift, I still didn't fully understand it. What was its purpose? What power did it hold? I didn't want to rush her into talking before she was ready, but I had to know more. There was too much about her, about this whole situation, that I didn't understand. If I was going to help her, I needed answers, and I had to be careful. What if there were others looking for her? I knew I couldn't do this alone. Not completely. I set about collecting the firewood I'd need to make a small flame, trying to keep my mind occupied while I worked. The weight of everything felt heavier the longer I stood there. I was out of my element. This wasn't a normal problem. This was something far beyond anything I'd ever dealt with. I glanced back at the girl once more. She was still asleep, her expression soft but troubled, like she was caught between dreams and waking. The lines of exhaustion were still visible on her face, but she had a strange calmness to her, as though the world itself had granted her a temporary respite. My eyes traced the way her hair lay gently against the grass, how her chest rose and fell with each breath. There was a kind of fragility to her, something delicate and beautiful. I hadn't asked for this. I hadn't expected any of this. But now that she was here, now that I had made the promise to help, I couldn't imagine turning my back on her. My thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, barely a whisper, coming from her. It was a small, almost imperceptible shift in her breathing. I quickly knelt beside her, leaning in closer, feeling my heart rate pick up. "Hey," I whispered gently, reaching out to touch her hand. "Are you okay?" Her eyelids fluttered, opened slowly, her gaze locking onto mine, still filled with that quiet vulnerability. She blinked once, then twice, as though trying to focus on the world around her. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from the strain of speaking. I took a deep breath, pushing the unease out of my chest. "You're in the forest," I said softly. "You're safe. You're with me." She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her eyes searching mine. It was as though she were trying to piece together the fragments of memory, to understand where she was, what had happened. I don't remember much," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how I got here." "It's okay," I said, trying to reassure her, even though I wasn't sure I believed my own words. "We'll figure it out, I promise. You're not alone." She closed her eyes briefly, a soft sigh escaping her lips. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe her. I allowed myself to believe that together we could somehow find a way through this. We could find her home. But I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were too many unknowns. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever forces had brought her here, they wouldn't just go away. Something had been set in motion, and I was tangled in it now, whether I was ready or not. But there was one thing I knew for sure. I wasn't going to let her face it alone. "I won't leave you," I whispered, my voice firm despite the doubts gnawing at the edges of my mind. "I'll help you. I'll find a way." And in that moment, as her eyes locked onto mine, I knew we were bound by something deeper than simple chance, something that couldn't be broken, no matter what lay ahead. Together, we would face whatever came next. The days passed by in a blur. The forest had become our home, our sanctuary, at least for the time being. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an unspoken connection to the alien girl I had found, a bond that grew stronger with each passing day. Her name, as she had whispered to me once, was Ishara. She still didn't remember much about her origins, or the circumstances that had led her here. But there was a peace between us now, a quiet understanding that allowed us both to heal. We spent our days quietly, gathering food, exploring the forest, and keeping a cautious watch for anything or anyone that might threaten her. There were moments of laughter, short bursts of joy when we shared stories or laughed at little things, but beneath it all, there was always the weight of uncertainty. Every time I looked at Ishara, I wondered what had brought her to this strange world and whether there were others looking for her. She was healing slowly but surely. Her condition had improved remarkably after the milk she had given me. There was something almost miraculous about it. She had explained to me, as best as she could, that it was not just sustenance but something that helped balance the body, repair and restore. It was the kind of thing that she would share with those closest to her in her world. I hadn't questioned it. All I knew was that it was working, and it was keeping her alive. I had learned much from her. Not just about her abilities, but about the way she viewed the world, her compassion, her strength despite the delicate nature of her being, and the deep sadness that lingered in her eyes, a sadness that spoke of something much older than her years. There were times when she would stare off into the distance, lost in thought, and I knew she was remembering pieces of her past. I wanted to ask her more, to pull the stories from her, but I could tell she wasn't ready. I respected her silence, as she had respected mine, but the more time we spent together, the more I realized that the world outside of this forest, the life I had left behind, was beginning to feel like a distant memory. There were times when I could hardly remember the normalcy of my previous life, the job I had once worked at, the people I'd known, the plans I had made. Now all that mattered was this strange, fragile being that had entered my life, and the promise I had made to protect her. It was on the 7th night that everything changed. We had been sitting around the small fire we'd built, the crackling sound of the flames filling the otherwise quiet night. The stars above us were brighter than I had ever seen, and the world around us seemed almost enchanted in its stillness. Ishara sat beside me, her eyes distant again, though not in the same way they had been in the early days of our meeting. This time, her expression held a deeper resolve, as though something had shifted inside of her. I glanced at her, noticing the slight change in her demeanor. Her posture was more upright, her hands resting on her knees with a steady, purposeful calm. She was preparing for something. I could feel it even if I didn't understand exactly what it was. "Ishara?" I asked, my voice breaking the silence. She turned to me, and for the first time in days I saw a glimmer of the old fire in her eyes, a spark of the person I had first encountered, the one who had been so lost and vulnerable when I had found her. "I have to go," she said simply, her voice steady but filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Fear? Hope? I blinked, taken aback. "What do you mean? Go where?" "Home," she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. I can't stay here forever. It's not where I belong. But you, I began, struggling to find the right words. You're not fully healed yet. You can't just leave. She shook her head softly, a faint, sad smile curving on her lips. I'm not entirely healed, I know, but I can't keep running from what's waiting for me. It's time to face it. And it's time to face the consequences of my journey. My chest tightened as I realized what she was saying. You're not just leaving, are you? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. You're leaving for good. You're going back to wherever you came from. Ishara didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stood up slowly, gazing at the stars above as though they held the answers she needed. After a long pause, she turned back to me, her expression softening. I don't want to go, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But I have to. I owe it to myself. And to you. I rose to my feet, feeling a surge of panic rising within me. No, you don't owe me anything. You've already given me more than I ever thought I could have. I stopped, my voice catching in my throat. I just don't want to lose you. Her eyes softened with sympathy, but there was a quiet strength in her gaze. You won't lose me, she said, her voice like a gentle breeze. Not truly. You will always be a part of me, and I will always carry you with me. I wanted to protest, to hold on to her, to beg her to stay, but I knew deep down that this was her decision. She wasn't asking for my permission. She was simply telling me the truth that had been building in her heart all along. You'll find your way, she said, taking a step closer to me, her hand resting gently on my arm. Just like I found mine. You've already given me the strength to keep going, and now it's my turn to give you that same strength. To trust that you'll be okay even when I'm gone. I swallowed hard, blinking back the tears that threatened to spill over. I don't know how to do this without you. She smiled softly, a tender expression that carried so much emotion. You won't have to. You'll carry the lessons you've learned from me with you. You'll be stronger for it. And then, with a final lingering look, she turned away from me, stepping into the darkness of the forest. I wanted to chase after her, to stop her from leaving, but my feet felt heavy as though I were rooted to the ground. I stood there, watching her disappear into the night until I could no longer see her. And even then, I didn't move. I stayed, letting the cool night air surround me, feeling the weight of her absence like a heavy cloak. Hours passed before I could bring myself to move. The fire had long since died down, and the once constant chirping of the forest seemed muted, as though the world was holding its breath. I walked through the woods, unsure of where I was headed, my mind lost in a fog of confusion and longing. But somewhere deep inside, I knew that this was what she needed. She had come to me when she was lost, when she was vulnerable, and now she was finding her way back to where she belonged. It wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't about what I wanted. It was about her. I found a quiet clearing, sitting on the ground and staring up at the stars, remembering the moments we'd shared, the quiet moments by the fire, the laughter, the pain, the bond that had formed between us. She was gone, but I wasn't empty. I had learned something powerful in the time we spent together, something that couldn't be taken away. She had given me a piece of herself, and in return I had given her the strength to face her own journey. The promise I had made to her, to never leave her side, hadn't been broken, because I had given her what she needed to go forward, and that was all she ever asked of me. And as I sat there, the wind whispering through the trees, I realized that the future wasn't something I could control, but I could face it with the same courage that Ishara had shown me, with the same quiet strength. And somewhere in a world beyond mine she would be carrying me with her just as I would carry her, forever.